So the Las Vegas Raiders have a matchup coming up against the Kansas City Chiefs. This is a matchup that I think means a lot, especially if you're a Kansas City Chiefs fan. If you're a Kansas City Chiefs quarterback, there's been a lot of bad blood between these two teams, and I think this is going to be an interesting matchup because a divisional rivalry, this is a game in which Patrick Mahomes is coming in 6-0. He wants to continue that trend. He hasn't lost since he last played the Raiders. And then on top of that, we've gotten troll videos with Kermit the Frog. We've gotten Antonio Pierce talking about the Jordan rules and how they're apparently taking shots at Patrick Mahomes, an extra elbow here or there. Plus, we also got some interesting updates coming out with some of our players. And Antonio Pierce said something about Desmond Ridder that I kind of want to talk about, because I think this is interesting that the Raiders are already at this point. Let's just get right into this video. So, of course, the last time that the Las Vegas Raiders played the Kansas City Chiefs, the Chiefs ultimately ended up losing to the Raiders. The Raiders came into that game and basically beat the shit out of the Kansas City Chiefs. The Raiders' defensive line dominated. The Raiders on the back end dominated, right? Patrick Mahomes had a really, really bad game. But the Raiders on the offensive side also kind of struggled that game. Let's be honest, the defense won us that game. Right? Patrick Mahomes had a couple of turnovers that led to touchdowns, and that was kind of the difference in the game. But more than that, that game kind of woke up the Chiefs, and that allowed the Chiefs to kind of go on that run to ultimately not lose a game the rest of the season, get into the Super Bowl, and then win that Super Bowl. But even that, they've come into this season and they're 6-0 at this point. They have not lost a game. And based off of what we've seen from the Kansas City Chiefs, I would make the argument it's the best Chiefs team I've ever seen. And the reason why is because they have an elite quarterback, but more than that, they're winning games because of basically everybody else on the team. Right? Their defense is top tier. Their wide receivers and tight ends are kind of just being productive. They're doing their job. The offensive line, the tackles have struggled a little bit, but they've been able to kind of do their thing as well. And Mahomes isn't throwing for 400 yards and 4 touchdowns every game. I mean, this guy has more interceptions than touchdowns this year. But yet, they're still 6-0. Now, that could be until the Raiders potentially beat them this week. We'll see what ends up happening. But Patrick Mahomes this week was asked a little bit about the Raiders' loss. And some people on social media are saying that Patrick Mahomes is taking a shot at the Las Vegas Raiders. Right? Some people are saying that Patrick Mahomes is actually talking about the Raiders, and I kind of want to have you guys listen in. The question he was asked was basically about the Raiders and the loss from last year. Check out what he had to say.
I think it was just a wake-up call for us to know that we're not going to be able to just come to the game and win. We kind of battled through the year, and it was like everybody was just we were just trying to build, especially I feel like myself, we were just building for the playoffs. We weren't even worried about the regular season. And
so some people are actually saying that Patrick Mahomes is saying that we thought we'd come into this game and basically just win, right? We overlooked this team. We didn't think twice about the Raiders. We obviously did not feel the Raiders were a good team. So, we came into that week, thought we were going to just roll over the Raiders, and that did not happen. More than that, he said we were essentially building towards the playoffs, right? We're looking forward to the playoffs because we don't really care about the regular season, right? Unlike the Raiders, the Chiefs are consistently making the playoffs. And some people are saying Patrick Mahomes is essentially just taking a shot at the Raiders, right? Saying they're a bad football team, they're unable to win games. And people are saying Patrick Mahomes is essentially talking about the Raiders. Now, he was also asked a follow-up question. Now, I'll be the first to tell you guys, I think what Patrick Mahomes does say essentially to the Raiders' loss last year, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a shot. I will say that Patrick Mahomes obviously did come into that game, as did the Chiefs, and they did overlook the Raiders, right? The Raiders had struggled mostly. They had a couple good games before that Chiefs game. But the Raiders showed up, right, as a team. They were able to kind of get it done. Now, he was asked another question, and this time he was asked about the Jordan rules, right? Essentially, Antonio Pierce, a couple weeks back, in the offseason, I should say, Antonio Pierce talked about how they essentially beat the Kansas City Chiefs, right? Antonio Pierce talked about how we had this plan that every time Patrick Mahomes tried running, he tried throwing, we're going to give him an elbow, right? An extra elbow here or there. We're going to make sure to hit him the same way that we saw teams take the same approach against Michael Jordan, where you're going to make sure to hit this guy. If he drives to the basket, hit him, right? Essentially try to get into that mind of Michael Jordan. And Antonio Pierce, we basically did that with Patrick Mahomes as well. And he talked about that on the Maxx Crosby podcast. Now, what's interesting about that conversation is some people thought that he may actually end up getting potentially suspended or fined because I guess it's technically legal to hit Patrick Mahomes. But then Mahomes was also asked about the Kermit the Frog video. Remember, we had Trey Taylor, the safety of the Las Vegas Raiders, take the Kermit the Frog, a puppet that essentially one of the fans brought, and he's kind of making fun of Patrick Mahomes. He called them some words as well. I want you guys to listen into what Patrick Mahomes had to say about both of those things.
You know, the talk afterwards that they had the secret, how to stop you, the little Kermit the Frog thing, all that stuff. Does that resonate with you at all this week?
I mean, I don't know if you would say resonates with me. I think just knowing that the competitive spirit that they have on that side is going to match the competitive spirit that we have. I think it's going to be a fun football game that we're going to get the best out of each and every player on that football field. And like I said, the best team will win.
So to me, Patrick Mahomes doesn't exactly answer, I think, the way he wants to answer, but you can look at the way, his face is as he's kind of answering. I can tell you guys right now that if the Kansas City Chiefs beat the Las Vegas Raiders in this game, they're going to have a lot to say. All right, Patrick Mahomes in his post-game presser, some of the players are going to be with Travis Kelce. Now, before we go forward, I want to just take a second to give a big shout out to the sponsor of this channel, because this content would not be possible without Underdog. If you guys have never utilized Underdog before, trust me, man, you guys are missing out. I don't do traditional fantasy sports that often. I did do one league this year, but generally speaking, I'm not really doing it anymore. And that's mostly because of Underdog. Underdog has this game that I really, really enjoy. It's called Pick'em. Essentially, you're going to go out there and just make picks that you think are going to be right. They'll have pretty much every pick you can think of for every player, and they have multiple categories as well. So an example would be, I think Aiden O'Connell is going to throw for 125 yards. And you're essentially just going to pick higher on that, right? I think he'll have more than 125 yards. You might say, hey, Dak Prescott's going to have at least 2 touchdowns. I'll pick higher on that. You might say Caleb Williams is going to have a rushing touchdown. And some of those stats also give you multipliers, right? So usually for quarterbacks rushing and in, right? That's something most quarterbacks aren't doing every single week. You'll get like a 4x multiplier on that. So depending on the multiplier, depending on how many picks, you can turn $5 into $400, $1,000, right? Whatever it ends up being. Obviously, it depends on the multiplier, but Underdog to me is one of those places that I pretty much do every single week at this point. Very fun. It makes like watching the Jets and the Dolphins without Tua. It makes them interesting, right? So check out Underdog. If you guys have never used them before, it is the best place. Trust me when I say that. Go to underdogfantasy.com, use my promo code that you guys see on the screen, or use the app. I recommend the app. So let's get right back into the content. All right, Patrick Mahomes in his post-game presser, some of the players are going to be with Travis Kelce, maybe some of these other guys, they're going to have a lot to say going into potentially, the day after, or even maybe right after the game. I think they're going to have a lot to say about the Las Vegas Raiders, right? They're going to have a lot to say about the Kermit the Frog video, about AP and the Jordan rules. In fact, I think the Chiefs are actually going to come into this Raiders game, and I think they're going to want to actually embarrass the Las Vegas Raiders. I think there's a real chance the Chiefs are going to try to run the score up against the Raiders. And I do think that if you're a Las Vegas Raiders fan, you cannot support let's tank this season, right? It's just not one of those things you want to do, especially not against the Kansas City Chiefs. So I hope the Raiders come in here and they beat up on Patrick Mahomes. They beat up on the Chiefs. Last year, both of the games were actually not that far apart, right? The Raiders were pretty close in the first one. The Chiefs were able to kind of run away with it towards the end of the game. The second time, obviously, the Raiders ended up winning. This week, if the Raiders want to actually get this win, they're going to have to be healthy. And that's another thing that I think the Raiders kind of have working for themselves. If you guys have not heard the news, Antonio Pierce did tell us that both Jakobi Meyers and Maxx Crosby took rest days yesterday, but they'll practice today and both are expected to play. So I've seen some of the videos with Jakobi and Maxx out there. Maxx looks good to go, right? He obviously had a rest day. Jakobi has missed 2 weeks, and he's practiced it this week, right? But he did have yesterday off specifically, and it does look like he'll be ready to go. And I think having Jakobi Meyers is massive for the Raiders. You got to have your best players out there. However you look at this right now, the Raiders' 3 best players on the offensive side is going to be Alexander Mattison, Jakobi Meyers, and Brock Bowers. Those are our 3 best players right now on the offensive side. We have to have all those guys essentially healthy, and we need these guys to show up as well. And one of the things that the Raiders have that's kind of going for them in this week is the Chiefs are pretty bad covering tight ends, right? Some of the tight ends they played have had really, really good games against them. And I think that's a scheme thing as well, right? Because the scheme that the Chiefs run a lot of times is going to be a too high shell, which is kind of the defense that most teams play in the NFL, minus a couple coaches out there like Dan Quinn, who runs that cover 3 look. But most teams run that cover 2 shell. But what ends up happening is then you get linebackers that end up covering your tight ends, right? And Brock Bowers is one of those guys that can come in and potentially have a lot of success. So keep an eye on Brock Bowers in this game. I think based off of the way the Chiefs are kind of built on the defensive side, You know, they have a really, really good defensive tackle in Chris Jones, and they do move this guy around a lot, right? So that's one of the things the Raiders are going to have to prepare for. But more than that, they need their guys back, right? Jakobi Meyers is a great wide receiver that can get open. He can beat single man. And I think for the Raiders to have success, you know, your quarterback obviously has to be the guy to win the game, but then you also need those weapons to make some plays. You know, Gardner Minshew can check the ball down, and I'm sure he'll hit his wide receiver if it's like a 2 or 3 yard pass. He might not hit him 15 yards downfield, but 2 or 3 yards, I'm sure he can make that pass. We need our guys to make plays. And of course, Maxx Crosby's going to be good to go. He did not practice, I think, pretty much this entire week, right? But apparently that's going to just be rest days for Maxx. I hope the Raiders show up, man. I really do hope they show up. I hope the Chiefs don't run over the Raiders. And I hope the Raiders can give the Kansas City Chiefs the first loss of the season. I think it's important for the Raiders to not overlook this season, right? And Antonio Pierce in his presser today actually talked about it. He said, we're not tanking this season, right? We're looking forward to winning football games. And the Raiders have to take that approach. I know some people are going to say, hey, lose every single game. You know, unfortunately, the Raiders are going to end up winning another 1 or 2 games this season, and we're not going to get the first, second, or third overall pick. So however you look at it, we're not going to have one of those picks. And this year's draft class at the quarterback position is not that good, right? Earlier on coming into the season, you know, we had like Bledsoe and NGS, which are the scouting companies that majority of NFL teams use. We have these companies put out reports, and I've seen the reports. I have access to them. If you guys want to see them, DM me on Twitter. I'll send them to you guys. We had those companies put out reports where they had like guys like Drew Aller of Penn State. They had Carson Beck. They had a couple other guys ranked super high, right? They had like first and second round grades on some of these guys. I think there were 4 guys. And they overlooked guys like Cam Ward. They overlooked some of these other guys. Jalen Milroe, right, did not have that high of a grade. Nussmeier, the LSU quarterback, did not have a high grade. These guys have skyrocketed. Some people are saying they're first round picks as well. So early on, we thought there were a ton of quarterbacks coming out, but now it's being kind of put out there, and we won't know officially until I'd say like January, February, depending on what actually gets put out in the updated version of those reports. We won't actually know if there's 3 first round quarterbacks or just 1, right? A friend of mine, Brett Coleman, who's very, very smart. I saw him post on Twitter. He thinks Cam Ward's the only quarterback he would take in the first round, and every other quarterback is not a first round quarterback. So what that means is unless you have the first overall pick, if you're the Las Vegas Raiders, you're not actually going to be able to get that quarterback, right? You're not going to be able to get Cam Ward, who most people do think right now is the number 1 quarterback. I kind of agree with that as well. I know Shedeur Sanders, a lot of people like him as well, and I do like him as well, but I'm not 100% sure if he's, you know, one of the quarterbacks we're going to take with, you know, whatever pick it is. But the good thing with that also is this, you know, teams have second round grades on Shedeur Sanders, and the Raiders end up winning finished with the 10th, 11th, 12th overall pick. They could technically draft Shedeur Sanders at that point, right? So just kind of keep in mind that you don't need a top 3 pick to get that quarterback. And I think for the Raiders, you got to win football games. You know, Bobby Slowick, Ben Johnson aren't taking jobs with the Raiders if you win 2 games this year. In fact, if you're Ben Johnson and you're looking at all the potential jobs, you know, the Patriots job might ultimately become available. The Jets job is going to be available. The Saints job might actually be available as well. On top of that, you know, if there's a team that's picking in the top 2 or 3, and they might not need a quarterback necessarily, but Ben Johnson or Bobby Slowick is hired, and they say, hey, you know, I'm not huge on Drake May. I'm not huge on Bryce Young or whoever it is, but since you have the 4th overall pick, if you take quarterback X, I'll take that job, right? It's not guaranteed that the Raiders are going to get one of these quarterbacks. Money doesn't even matter to some of these guys that are going to become head coaches. What matters is the team you're going to. Is that a good football team or not? Because Ben Johnson's going to have one opportunity over the next 15 years to be a head coach, and he wants to go to the best possible team. Same thing with Bobby Slowick. Same thing with some of the other guys that could become head coaches this cycle. Even guys that are thinking offensive coordinator jobs. There's a reason why the Raiders got stuck with Luke Getsy, right? Let's just be honest. There's a true reason. And for the Raiders, you got to try stacking up some wins. So I hope the Raiders can actually get some wins. Finally, let's wrap this video up a little bit. Gardner Minshew is going to get the start against the Chiefs. Not surprising at all. But Desmond Ridder is going to be the backup. And that's interesting to me because Ridder just came in like 2-3 days ago. And Ridder is going to be the backup against Kansas City Chiefs. Here's what could happen coming into this game. You know, Gardner Minshew can come in, throw 3 or 4 interceptions, are you going to stick with him as your quarterback? Or are you going to go with the guy you just signed 5 days earlier? Right? I almost feel like the Raiders are making a mistake here. I almost think that it makes more sense to make Desmond Ridder your third emergency quarterback and put Carter Bradley in there as your number 2 quarterback. If Gardner Minshew struggles, right, let's say the score is 30-7, Gardner Minshew's thrown 3 interceptions, I would rather put in a guy like Carter Bradley because he actually knows the playbook. Desmond Ridder doesn't know the playbook. Not that the playbook's very good, but he still does not know the playbook. So to me, I think that's a huge mistake by the Las Vegas Raiders. I think the Raiders should not have had Desmond Ridder be active because there's a chance he'll actually end up coming in. I think that's a mistake, but we'll see what ends up happening. AP also talked a little bit about why Desmond Ridder will be the backup. He says, we're not asking him to press and be the starting quarterback and help us turn this thing around. He's just a part of the puzzle. Confident player, sharp, working his tail off, learning the playbook. However AP wants to answer this question, I don't think AP's being honest on this one. It's kind of like how AP's answered some questions in the past. AP saying that we're not asking him to press and be the starting quarterback and help turn this thing around, but AP is secretly hoping Desmond Ridder can turn it around, right? AP actually wants to see a different quarterback come in and actually have success, right? Desmond Ridder was not signed because AP thinks he's a good backup quarterback. He's being signed because AP thinks there's a chance he can win some football games, right? To me, I think the Raiders got to do everything they can to have success, but also don't set up a guy to fail, right? Desmond Ridder might fail if you put him in there too early. And I'm not saying I'm 100% like, hey, Desmond Ridder's the future of the Raiders. I don't think that, right? I'm going to be honest, I don't think he's that good of a quarterback. But what I am saying is, if you threw Baker Mayfield in year 3 with the Raiders, the same way you're about to do with Desmond Ridder, 5 games into a whole new playbook, he's probably going to fail. And it's different if you have Sean McVay, who's a smart coach. We have Luke freaking Getsy, right? We literally have a terrible coach. So I think this is a bad move right here. If Antonio Pierce is the one that's making this decision, I'm not surprised, right? AP has made some questionable calls, but it might not be him, right? Maybe the Raiders are trying to tank because, hiring Luke Getsy to me means Tom Telesco is just 10 steps ahead of everybody. And he already knew, we hire Luke Getsy, we're not going to win many games, right? So maybe the tank has been in. We'll see what ends up happening. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, consider subscribing. And I'll see you guys next time with another video.